When justice turns to bloodshed, who is really being punished, or is society cheering? In November 1326, in Hereford, England, Hugh Despenser the Younger was not just executed. He was sacrificed, slowly, coldly, symbolically, in the brutal political theatre of the Middle Ages. His screams, echoing in the air thick with the smell of rust and blood, were not just the screams of physical pain, but the final words of a tyrannical era. His executioners did not just dismember him, they destroyed his name, his rank, and his manhood. A true sacrifice. But who was Hugh Despenser to die that way? He had been a minor nobleman, almost unknown, until he fell into the favor of King Edward II. From then on, Despenser not only became rich, but also powerful, to the point that the counts feared him, and the Queen retreated into the shadows to plot. For more than a decade, he manipulated the royal court as an invisible but all-powerful figure. But the darkness could not be hidden forever. When Queen Isabella rebelled, she wanted not only to dethrone him, but also to destroy the Despenser myth, to expose him to the people as a symbol of corruption, arrogance, and brutality. His method of execution, being dragged, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered, was chosen not for justice but for the art of revenge. Su oportunidad de cambiar de vida llegó cuando el dictador Sila, despiadado, prohibió la entrada y publicó una lista de enemigos del Estado, junto con la confiscación de todos sus bienes. Con ojos de depredador, Craso no vio una purga, sino un tesoro. Recorrió las propiedades confiscadas, comprándolas a precios desorbitados a familias desesperadas, más preocupadas por salvar sus vidas que sus hogares. Mansiones que antaño valían una fortuna cayeron en sus manos por a society where unlimited ambition could lift people from nothing to the top, then knock them down into the abyss of humiliation. Despenser was a fire that burned fiercely, but then died in its own ashes. Today, we return to that past, listening to the cold wind blowing through the old stone walls to tell the story not only of a death, but of a system that killed the soul before killing the body. So why are there men who do not need to usurp the throne, but make the whole kingdom tremble? Around 1286, in an England where loyalty to the throne could be the ladder to heaven or the rope that hangs a family, a child was born named Hugh Despenser the Younger. The name was not just a legacy, it was a curse. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had etched the Despenser name into history as a symbol of ruthless loyalty and uncompromising strategy, a courtier more feared than his enemies. Young Hugh grew up not only in the shadow of his father, but in the shadow of a changing dynasty. King Edward I, the sledgehammer of Scotland, died in 1307, leaving the throne to his opposite, Edward II, a king who loved art more than battle, the company of his favorites more than the sound of the sword and the duty of government. It was in this rift that a door opened for the bloodthirsty, power-hungry Hugh Despenser. Edward II's blind favour for Piers Gaveston, rumoured to be the king's lover, ignited a fury among the English nobility. And when Gaveston was assassinated in 1312, the throne lost a shadow. But he also invited a storm. Hugh Despenser was no outsider. He was of English noble blood and had something Gaveston never had, the political instinct of a wolf. He sought not flamboyant titles or courtly glory, but the slow, steady, inextricable web of power he had built up. Where Gaveston was a flash in the pan, Despenser was the dagger up the sleeve of the crown. He did not simply want to stand near the throne, he wanted to hold the hand of the one who sat on it and make the realm listen to his whispers. How could a courtier transform himself into a powerful shadow that controlled an entire dynasty? By 1318, Hugh Despenser had infiltrated Edward II's inner circle, not only as the king's favorite, but also, according to many rumors, as his secret lover. But unlike those who had crossed the royal bed, Despenser brought with him a whirlwind of political ambition and deadly sophistication, which dwarfed the influence of his predecessor, Gaveston, in the wind. He wanted more than just a courtier. Hugh Despenser wanted to be the king's voice, the king's arm, and ultimately the king's replacement in all but name. The transition from obedient courtier to shadowy ruler began when he was given key positions in Edward II's administration. Para Craso, la guerra contra Partia era más que una simple oportunidad para ganar más oro. Era su última apuesta para alcanzar lo que había estado perdiendo toda su vida, la gloria digna de Pompeyo y César. Se dice que las ciudades partas brillaban bajo el sol, eran como el oro. Esas historias eran como un fuego que ardía en la imaginación de Craso, impulsándolo a perseguir un sueño que podía convertirse en una pesadilla. Despenser identified each potential rival among the nobility and smothered them with a web of legal manipulation, economic coercion, and when necessary, force. Lands were seized through perfectly tailored accusations, families were arrested, traditional privileges were crushed under the guise of feudal law, a law he bent like candle wax. The semi-autonomous Welsh Marches, a potentially fertile border region, became Despenser's strategic obsession. There he staged artificial conflicts with the Marcher lords, then quietly seized territory when his victims were exhausted or exiled. In less than a decade, Hugh Despenser had built an empire large enough to threaten the throne. But what made Despenser more terrifying than any other opportunist in English history was not just his power, but the way he legitimized it. Unlike previous favorites who relied solely on the king's favor, Despenser built a complex system of paperwork that gave every act of plunder a glittering legal veneer. He filled the courts with his own men, manipulated parliament like a puppet, and left an administrative trail that gave his usurpations and political repressions the appearance of legality. Hugh Despenser, padre e hijo, se aprovecharon de la ciega confianza del rey para amasar riquezas, apoderarse de tierras, eliminar enemigos y convertir el reino en un instrumento de venganza personal. Una vez más, la ciega lealtad de Eduardo sumió al país en un derramamiento de sangre. A medida que la juventud y el encanto de Isabel se desvanecían bajo la sombra de los favoritos de su esposo, un sentimiento que trascendía el resentimiento comenzó a crecer en ella. The king had become increasingly dependent on Despenser, both politically and personally. Every major decision had to be made through him, to the point that foreign envoys found that meetings with the king were a mere formality and that real negotiations took place behind closed doors, with Despenser as the decision-maker. The old aristocracy, once the backbone of the monarchy, was now marginalized. They were no longer the shapers of the nation, but unwilling spectators in their own kingdom. Despenser's rule was maintained by a sophisticated campaign of terror and ruthless, targeting anyone who dared to resist. His opponents were not only politically excluded, but also ruthlessly eliminated. A prime example was the death of Thomas of Lancaster, one of the most powerful lords and the king's cousin. In 1322, he was executed for leading a rebellion to overthrow Despenser. The message was clear: not even royal relatives were allowed to oppose the real power. Los partos adoptaron una táctica de ataque y retirada. Los arqueros de caballería dispararon ráfagas de flechas y se retiraron rápidamente fuera de su alcance. Los romanos, conocidos por sus formaciones cerradas, se convirtieron en blancos inmóviles en campo abierto. Las flechas perforantes de los arcos partos causaron constantes bajas, minando la moral y la disciplina en la formación. Desesperado, Publio lideró una carga de caballería hacia el centro del cerco para contraatacar, pero esta era una trampa tendida por Surena. Alejado demasiado de la fuerza principal, Publio y sus valientes soldados fueron rápidamente rodeados, luchando hasta el agotamiento. Gravemente herido y sabiendo que no podía escapar, Publio pidió a su guardia que se quitara la vida para evitar ser hecho prisionero. Después de Bannockburn, la oposición aristocrática pasó de un descontento susurrante a un desafío organizado, liderado nada menos que por su propio primo, Tomás de Lancaster. Quienes antaño juraron servir a la corona, ahora exigían el derecho a aprobar nombramientos reales, supervisar las finanzas y, en la práctica, despojar a Eduardo del poder real. El rey estaba siendo reducido a una figura decorativa vacía, un eco de autoridad sin sustancia. Ya no se trataba de un desacuerdo político. What was even more worrying was Despenser's attitude towards the church. While the Middle Ages, although he considered religion sacrosanct, he dared to arrest bishops, seize church lands, and manipulate church law for personal gain. When Bishop Adam Orleton of Hereford spoke out against royal policy, he was arrested and tortured by Despenser. This sacrilegious act deeply shocked even those accustomed to the brutality of the times, adding serious crimes to Despenser's black record. Which name would be chosen to continue? By the early 1320s, the undercurrent of tension had reached the heart of the royal family, Queen Isabella. As the wife of Edward II and daughter of the King of France, she had been seen as a symbol of female power in Europe. But in a court increasingly dominated by Hugh Despenser the Younger, her status and influence were quickly eroded. Despenser not only stripped her of her privileges, but also ordered her allowances reduced and isolated her from the king, as if her presence were a threat that needed to be eliminated. However, Isabella was not the type of woman to quietly accept humiliation. In 1325, under diplomatic pretext, she was sent to France to negotiate control of Gascony with her brother, King Charles IV. This trip proved to be a turning point. Far from Despenser's reach, Isabella began to build a resistance network. In Paris, she approached English nobles who had been exiled by political persecution. Among them was Roger Mortimer, a powerful lord who had escaped Despenser's persecution. The alliance between Isabella and Mortimer soon became the nucleus of a large-scale campaign of resistance. Isabella quickly made herself a symbol of righteousness, a queen banished from her country by bigotry and abuse of power. In public statements, she accused Despenser of breaking the law, looting noble estates, and even oppressing the church. Notably, she denounced him as a corrupt expression of the national spirit, even though he was English. This powerful message resonated throughout Europe, where the consequences of royal favors getting out of hand were well understood. By 1326, Isabella had assembled an army and was ready to embark on this journey home, with the fire of revolution burning in her. Have you ever wondered what would happen if an empire built on fear collapsed in a matter of weeks? That is exactly what happened in the autumn of 1326, when Queen Isabella arrived in England, not as an invader, but as a symbol of liberation. Instead of encountering resistance, she was welcomed by the people of Essex. After years of oppression by the Despensers, the people, from the exhausted commoners to the suppressed nobility, saw her arrival as an opportunity to turn the tables. The change of heart was swift. Nobles who had served Edward II out of fear of his favorite now saw an opportunity for revenge and turned against him. The king and Hugh Despenser, father and son, hastily retreated to Wales, where they had believed they still had loyalty and control. But even there, the situation was no better. Local leaders, calculating the pros and cons for their future, choosing to side with Isabella, whom they believed would lead England into a new chapter, rather than a king who had lost the people's support. Everything the Despensers had once controlled, networks of power, patronage and intimidation, now looked like sandcastles before the tide of genuine resistance. Hugh Despenser the Elder was the first to fall to the rebels as he tried to hold Bristol. His execution was swift, but with a strong message. Hanged, dragged and torn to pieces, his head hung on London Bridge as an unmistakable symbol of warning. But that was only the beginning. The main course, both literally and symbolically, was his son. Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured near L'Entresant on the 16th of November. Contemporary accounts describe a man who once held the kingdom in his hands as so shaken and broken that he is said to have tried to kill himself to avoid capture. But those who pursued him would not let it happen. Justice, as they understood it, had to be done publicly. No one really doubted that Despenser would die. The only thing that mattered was the manner. Isabella and her advisors understood that this was not just punishment, it was a political stunt. Despenser's death had to assuage the pain of those he had wronged, send a warning to future favorites, and above all, cleanse the kingdom of the vestiges of an era of corruption. On a cold November morning in 1326, a stage was set for death in the heart of Hereford, where his power had once been turned into a bloody arena of revenge. Hugh Despenser the Younger, who had made lords tremble and England cower in fear, was now the final puppet in a brutal medieval political drama. His execution was not a mere punishment, it was a symbolic act of destruction. And the choice of Hereford on the Welsh border was no accident. It was here that Despenser had tortured Bishop Adam Alton and where he wielded his greatest power. Thousands of people gathered, not only to satisfy their dark curiosity, but also to witness a chapter of history close in blood and fire. There was no trial, there was no chance of justification. Only a long list of crimes, read aloud to the crowds screaming for justice. Treason, usurpation of royal lands, oppression of nobles, insult to the church, and destruction of morals through his alleged sick relationship with the king. Each charge was read out, a deep cut into his once inviolable reputation. Despenser was stripped naked and dragged through the streets as a living symbol of his downfall. Taunts, filth and hateful glares surrounded the man who had once been the second in command of the country. He was then tied to a horse and dragged through the cobbled streets, his body broken but not yet finished. The real punishment began when he was hung, not to die, but to suffocate slowly to the laughter of the crowd. When he was lowered, Despenser was nothing more than a living corpse, and it was then that his executioners took a step further into barbarism. To humiliate his rumored relationship with Edward II, they cut off his genitals and threw them into the fire with a clear message about severing his genitals. Feelings were considered treasonous to the royal mandate. Next, his stomach was slit open, his intestines ripped out while he was still conscious. The torture techniques of the Middle Ages were enough to keep the victim alive for every second, every minute, so that the pain would not end, but would last into a waking nightmare. His heart was torn out and thrown into the fire, as one would burn away the very last of subversive intentions and false feelings. The dispenser's screams merged with the hysterical cheers and then fell silent. He tried to say something, a confession, a plea. No one could hear clearly. In that moment, the man who had silenced the kingdom when he spoke could no longer speak through his own pain. The final stage was the dismemberment. 4 horses pulled him from all sides. His limbs were torn off. His head was severed and hung on London Bridge, next to his father's, as a chilling warning to anyone who would reclaim glory from the darkness. The remains were scattered across cities so that the death of Hugh Despenser would not only be the end of a life, but a living warning engraved on the memory of the entire kingdom. In the immediate aftermath of Hugh Despenser's execution, England was in a state of both excitement and political calculation. In Hereford, the mood was less somber than festive, with songs and satirical poems circulating. Many were sarcastic, even provocative, attempts to undermine the reputation of a man who had once held supreme power. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella seized the opportunity to assert her political position. Soon after, her husband, King Edward II, was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III, with Isabella acting as regent. A new narrative quickly emerged. She was celebrated as having freed the country from the grip of its cruel advisors and restored order. Despenser's execution was portrayed as a necessary act of justice rather than a mere act of revenge. The psychological impact of this event on the aristocracy was profound. The manner of his execution was seen as a stark warning to anyone who would dare to reassert too much power in the harem or penetrate too deeply into the heart of court power. Although only an individual, Despenser's death brought about major changes in the social structure. Vast lands that had belonged to him were redistributed to Isabella's supporters, altering the balance of power among the nobility. Many families that had suffered under his policies were restored to honor and wealth, while those who had been loyal to him faced punishment, loss, and exile. The impact of the incident spread far beyond England's borders. European courts watched the events with mixed emotions, fascinated by the vicissitudes of power and horrified by the brutality of the punishment. Isabella's rebellion quickly became a symbol of noble women confronting corrupt power structures, especially when court favorites exceeded the limits of political influence. The legacy of this execution extends beyond the annals of medieval English history to the shaping of ideas about power and punishment in politics. Despenser's execution, with its series of harsh punishments including hanging, castration, disembowelment and quartering, was intended not only to remove him from political life, but also to send a clear message: abuse of power would not be tolerated. These measures were later enshrined in English law as the standard punishment for treason, a pattern that lasted into the 18th century. From a legal perspective, his case established a precedent for the prosecution of treason against the crown, influencing how similar cases were judged in the future. The pain he endured was inscribed into the core of the legal system as a form of deterrence. However, modern historians still debate the justification of Despenser's sentence. While few would dispute that he did harm during his time in power, the complexity and brutality of his execution raises questions about his true motives. Was it justice, or was it personal vengeance? The manner of execution seems to reflect both the level of hatred and the need to demonstrate power in public. In particular, the gender element of the punishment, specifically castration, suggests much about medieval attitudes towards homosexuality and relationships considered to be against the norm. In contemporary culture, intimate relationships between men in the royal court, especially with the king, were seen as a direct threat to the order of power. Thus, Despenser's execution is also seen as a warning about the thin line between favor and moral decadence. Finally, the level of detail and meticulousness in the punishment was aimed not only at his body, but also at the destruction of his honor, identity, and political legacy. Behind the execution was a society filled with resentment, where the resentment of the aristocracy and the people had been building up for years and was released in that brutal scene. Can you imagine? Was that punishment just justice, or was it a sign of a time when violence was considered the most effective way to restore the law? Can a man become a symbol of fear and retribution simply because he once wielded too much power? When we look back at the tragic end of Hugh Despenser the Younger, we are confronted not only with a historical criminal, but also with troubling questions about the limits of justice, morality, and human nature. His career, from influential aristocrat to manipulator of the throne, reflects the corruption that absolute power can cause, even in individuals raised in education and nobility. His execution was not a simple punishment. It was a public ritual designed to be dramatic, not only to punish the guilty, but also to relieve the anger of the crowd. While there is no denying the seriousness of his wrongdoings, the meticulous spectacle of his torture raises a larger question. What are the limits to the retribution that society can justify? Can brutality be considered justice when it is carried out in the name of preserving order? The crowd that cheered as he suffered were not only witnesses, but also participants. That collective reaction revealed a deep part of the human psyche, the dangerous pleasure of seeing a powerful figure struck down. In this context, both the executioner and the witness became links in a chain of inhumane acts justified by the notion of justice. Despenser's regime itself was an example of how terror can be institutionalized by instilling fear, rewarding obedience, and gradually distorting moral standards. In such an environment, even the oppressed gradually become the system's maintainers, not because they believe in it, but because resistance can mean death. But perhaps what is most disturbing is not his crime, but the ease with which educated and righteous men carried out such cruelty, believing that they were acting in the right way. They were not barbarians, but products of a society that believed that morality could be flexed to political ends. If the line between civility and barbarism is so thin, how can we be sure which side we stand on?